a news thing that I do. And I was talking about Buffalo Bills quarterback.
He spent decades telling people how to fix their marriages. Millions listened to him. Millions trusted him. On television, Dr. Phil became the voice of reason for broken relationships, family fights, addiction, and emotional pain. He was calm, direct, and confident. He told people hard truths and promised that honesty was the first step toward healing. But long before Dr. Phil became America's most famous relationship expert, his own personal life was already falling apart. And the story of his first marriage would later raise uncomfortable questions about the man behind the microphone. For years, the public only saw one version of Dr. Phil: a successful psychologist, a best-selling author, a trusted TV personality backed by Oprah Winfrey herself. But behind that public image was a past relationship that ended quietly, painfully, and surrounded by controversy. His first wife, Debbie Higgins, would later claim that their marriage was nothing like the calm, logical, and supportive relationships Dr. Phil encouraged on television. According to her, the truth was far more complicated. To understand how this happened, we need to go back long before the fame, the TV cameras, and the applause. We need to go back to a time when Dr. Phil was just Phil McGraw, a young man with big dreams, little money, and no idea that his personal choices would one day be judged by millions. Philip Calvin McGraw was born on September 1st, 1950, in Veneta, Oklahoma. He grew up in a modest household with his parents and three sisters. His father, Joseph McGraw, worked as an oil equipment supplier, and his mother, Ann Geraldine, focused on raising the family. Life was not luxurious, money was tight, and hard work was expected from everyone. Phil learned early that nothing came easy, and that success required discipline and effort. As a teenager, Phil was active and competitive. He stood out in school, especially in sports. Football became a major part of his identity. He was strong, focused, and driven, and his talent on the field earned him a football scholarship to the University of Tulsa. For a while, it looked like sports might be his future. But that future ended suddenly when he suffered a serious injury. The injury was bad enough to end his football career before it truly began. Losing football was a major turning point. Phil was forced to rethink his entire life plan. The identity he had built around athletics disappeared almost overnight. Like many young people facing sudden change, he had to decide who he was without the thing that defined him. This moment would shape many of the choices he made later, both professionally and personally. After leaving the University of Tulsa, Phil transferred to Midwestern State University in Wichita Falls, Texas. This time, instead of focusing on sports, he turned his attention to psychology. He became interested in how people think, why they behave the way they do, and how pressure can change decision-making. In 1975, he earned his bachelor's degree. He then continued his education at the University of North Texas, where he completed both his master's degree and his doctorate in psychology. By the late 1970s, Phil McGraw was officially a licensed psychologist. On paper, his future looked promising. He had education, ambition, and a clear direction. But professional success did not come instantly. He worked in private practice for a short time, seeing patients face to face. While this gave him experience, it did not fully satisfy him. Traditional therapy felt limiting to him. He wanted something bigger, something that involved strategy, pressure, and high-stakes decision-making. That desire led him in an unexpected direction. Instead of focusing on therapy alone, Phil became interested in how psychology could be used in legal settings. He studied how juries think, how witnesses appear under pressure, and how lawyers present their cases. This interest eventually led to the creation of Courtroom Sciences Incorporated, also known as CSI, which he co-founded in 1990 with attorney Gary Dobbs. CSI specialized in trial consulting. Their job was to help lawyers understand juries, prepare witnesses, and shape courtroom strategies. The company worked behind the scenes on major cases involving powerful corporations and high-profile legal battles. CSI became very successful, but Phil himself remained unknown to the general public. At this point, his influence was limited to courtrooms and law offices. Everything changed in the mid-1990s during one of the most famous legal battles of the decade. Oprah Winfrey was being sued by the Texas beef industry after comments she made on her show. The case attracted massive media attention. Oprah hired CSI to help her prepare, and Phil worked directly with her during the trial. He coached her on how to present herself, how to handle pressure, and how to communicate clearly in court. Oprah won the case, and more importantly, she trusted Phil. That trust would change his life forever. After the trial, Oprah began inviting Phil onto her show as a guest expert. From his very first appearance, he stood out. He didn't speak in complex academic language. He didn't hide behind theories. He spoke plainly. He challenged people directly. He told guests what they didn't want to hear, and the audience responded immediately. Viewers liked his honesty. They liked that he didn't pretend to be gentle when the truth was uncomfortable. Soon, his appearances became regular segments. By the late 1990s, Dr. Phil was a familiar face to millions of Americans. He had gone from courtroom consultant to television personality in a remarkably short time. With Oprah's support, Dr. Phil launched his own daytime television show in 2002. The format was simple. Real people, real problems, direct advice. The show covered topics like marriage breakdowns, parenting struggles, addiction, and emotional trauma. It became one of the most watched daytime programs in the country and ran for more than 20 seasons. Dr. Phil became a brand. He wrote best-selling books. He produced other television shows. He built a media empire. To the public, he was the man who understood relationships better than anyone else. But while his career was rising, there was a story from his past that remained mostly untold. A story about a young marriage that ended long before the fame. A marriage that, according to his first wife, left emotional scars that never fully healed. Before the talk show, before the audience applause, before America trusted him with their deepest personal problems, Dr. Phil was already navigating a relationship that was quietly falling apart. And at the center of that story was a woman named Debbie Higgins. Their relationship began when they were teenagers. They met in high school in Kansas. Phil was ambitious and driven, even at a young age. Debbie was outgoing, warm, and deeply invested in the people she loved. They became high school sweethearts, building a relationship in a small-town environment where everyone knew their names and expected them to stay together. They were young. They were in love. And like many young couples, they believed love alone would be enough. In 1970, when Phil was just 20 years old, they got married in a small church ceremony surrounded by family and friends. It was a simple wedding. No fame, no cameras. Just two young people promising a future they hadn't yet learned how to manage. At the time, no one could have predicted how far Phil would go, or how painful that first marriage would become. When Phil and Debbie McGraw began their married life, everything looked normal from the outside. They were young, hopeful, and building a future together step by step. Phil was focused on his education and career, and Debbie took on the role that many women were expected to take at the time. She managed the home, supported her husband's goals, and believed that their sacrifices would eventually lead to a stable and happy life. In the early days, there was no fame and no public pressure. There were no television studios or book deals. There were only long hours, limited money, and the stress that often comes with being young and married. Phil moved between schools as he continued his education, and Debbie followed him, adjusting her own life to match his changing plans. She put her own ambitions aside, believing that supporting her husband was the best way to invest in their future together. But over time, small problems began to grow. According to later accounts, the marriage started to feel unbalanced. Phil was deeply focused on his goals, his studies, and his sense of direction. Debbie, meanwhile, felt increasingly alone. The emotional connection they once shared as teenagers began to fade. Conversations became shorter, tension became more common, and the excitement of being newly married slowly gave way to frustration. One of the biggest challenges was how young they were when they married. Neither of them had fully figured out who they were as individuals. They were growing, changing, and learning about life at the same time they were trying to hold a marriage together. As Phil became more driven and focused, Debbie felt that her role was shrinking. Instead of growing together, they seemed to be moving in different emotional directions. Years later, Debbie would make claims that painted a painful picture of their life behind closed doors. She alleged that Phil became emotionally distant and controlling. According to her, he expected obedience rather than partnership. She claimed that her opinions and feelings were often dismissed, and that she felt more like a support system than an equal partner. Debbie also stated that Phil strongly discouraged her from working or pursuing independence. She said that he wanted her to remain at home and focus entirely on his success. At the time, this may not have seemed unusual to outsiders, given social norms of the era. But for Debbie, it created a growing sense of isolation and loss of identity. As Phil moved deeper into psychology and professional ambition, Debbie felt increasingly invisible. She described feeling trapped in a life that revolved around someone else's goals. According to her, the marriage no longer felt like a shared journey. It felt like a one-way street. It is important to note that these claims came from Debbie's perspective. Phil has denied wrongdoing and has not publicly agreed with her version of events. However, her statements added a serious layer of complexity to his public image, especially considering his later career as a relationship expert. The emotional distance between them continued to grow. There were no children to anchor them together. There was no shared project beyond survival and education. Over time, resentment built. Debbie later said that she felt emotionally abandoned, even while living under the same roof. Eventually, the marriage reached a breaking point. After only a few years together, Phil and Debbie separated. The divorce was finalized in 1973, just 3 years after they were married. There were no public statements, no media coverage. At the time, Phil was still unknown, and the divorce passed quietly. For Phil, the divorce marked the end of a chapter he would rarely speak about. He moved forward with his education and career, eventually remarrying and building the public life people recognize today. For Debbie, the divorce was not something she could easily leave behind. Years later, Debbie would speak openly about the emotional impact of the marriage and its end. She claimed that the experience deeply affected her mental health and sense of self-worth. According to her, the relationship left lasting emotional scars that influenced the rest of her life. These claims would not become widely known until much later, after Dr. Phil had already become famous. When they did surface, they raised difficult questions. How could a man who taught millions about healthy relationships have such a troubled past marriage? Was his advice shaped by personal growth, or was there a disconnect between his words and his actions? Phil has addressed his first marriage only briefly over the years. He has acknowledged that he was very young and inexperienced at the time. He has said that the marriage did not work, and that both he and Debbie were not ready for such a commitment. He has not gone into detail about her specific claims, choosing instead to focus on the lessons learned and the life he built afterward. To his supporters, this explanation is enough. People grow, people change. A failed marriage at a young age does not define a lifetime. To critics, however, the lack of detailed response feels uncomfortable, especially given his career built on analyzing other people's relationships. The controversy surrounding the marriage has followed Dr. Phil quietly over the years. It has never fully disappeared, but it has also never taken center stage in his public narrative. His success, influence, and television presence have largely overshadowed the story of Debbie Higgins. Still, the contrast remains striking. On television, Dr. Phil encourages honesty, accountability, and emotional awareness. Yet, in his own past, there is a relationship that ended in silence and unresolved accusations. The story of Phil and Debbie's marriage is not just about blame. It is about youth, ambition, power imbalance, and emotional disconnect. It is about two people who entered marriage too early and discovered that love alone was not enough to carry them through. For Debbie, the marriage became a defining emotional experience that she would later feel compelled to speak about. For Phil, it became a closed chapter, one he rarely revisited publicly. As Dr. Phil's career continued to grow, the gap between his public persona and his private past became wider. And eventually, that gap would raise a question many viewers would begin to ask. Can someone who failed so deeply in their own first marriage truly understand how to guide others? That question does not have a simple answer. And in the final part of this story, we look at how Dr. Phil addressed his past, how the public responded, and what this story ultimately says about fame, growth, and accountability. By the time Dr. Phil became a household name, his first marriage was already decades behind him. To most viewers, it didn't exist at all. They knew him as the confident expert on relationships, the man who offered direct advice and demanded personal responsibility. His past was rarely mentioned, and when it was usually summarized in a single sentence. He had been married before. It didn't work out. He moved on. For many years, that simple explanation was enough. Dr. Phil's success continued to grow. His television show dominated daytime ratings. His books sold millions of copies. His advice shaped how people talked about relationships, parenting, and personal growth. The public trusted him, and trust is powerful. When people trust someone, they rarely question what came before. That changed when Debbie Higgins spoke publicly about their marriage. Her statements did not come during a major media interview or a televised confrontation. Instead, they appeared in written accounts and legal records that slowly made their way into public discussion. Debbie claimed that the marriage left her emotionally damaged. She described feeling controlled, dismissed, and isolated during their time together. According to her, the relationship affected her confidence, mental health, and ability to trust others long after the divorce. These claims did not explode into a massive scandal, but they quietly circulated online and among critics. Some people dismissed them as the reflections of a painful past. Others saw them as deeply troubling, especially given Dr. Phil's role as a relationship authority. The contrast between his advice and these accusations created discomfort. Dr. Phil's response has always been limited. He has acknowledged the marriage and the divorce, but he has never addressed the details of Debbie's claims publicly. He has said that they were both very young, that the relationship was unhealthy, and that it ended long before he became who he is today. He emphasizes growth, learning, and accountability without revisiting specific events. This silence has been interpreted in different ways. Supporters believe he has the right to privacy. They argue that a failed marriage from decades ago should not define a person's entire life. They point out that many people grow wiser through failure, and that his career may be shaped by lessons learned the hard way. Critics see it differently. They argue that someone who asks others to take responsibility should be willing to fully confront their own past. They question whether avoiding detailed discussion weakens his credibility. For them, the silence feels less like privacy and more like avoidance. The truth likely exists somewhere in between. People change. A 20-year-old is not the same person they will be at 50 or 70. Immaturity, ambition, and fear can shape behavior in ways people later regret. At the same time, emotional harm does not disappear simply because years pass. For Debbie, the marriage remained a defining experience, one that influenced her sense of self and her emotional well-being. This story raises a difficult question about public figures. Do we judge people by who they were or by who they become? And if someone builds a career on giving advice, does that create a higher standard for accountability? Dr. Phil has built his public message around responsibility, self-awareness, and change. He often tells guests that understanding their past is necessary to improve their future. Yet when it comes to his own first marriage, he has chosen to keep details private. Some viewers accept that choice, others find it uncomfortable. It is also important to understand that relationships are complex. There are always multiple perspectives. Debbie's account reflects her truth and her experience. Dr. Phil's silence reflects his choice to move forward rather than look back. Without full transparency from both sides, the complete truth remains unknown. What is clear is that the marriage left a lasting impact on both of them in different ways. For Debbie, speaking out later in life may have been a way to reclaim her voice. For Dr. Phil, the marriage may represent a painful chapter he prefers not to reopen. Neither response is simple, and neither erases what happened. As Dr. Phil's television show came to an end in 2023, many people began to reflect on his legacy. He changed daytime television. He influenced how mental health conversations entered mainstream culture. He helped some people confront difficult truths about their lives. He also faced criticism for oversimplifying complex issues and for the power imbalance inherent in televised therapy. His first marriage adds another layer to that legacy. It reminds us that experts are still human, that authority does not equal perfection, and that growth often comes from failure, even when that failure hurts others. In the end, the story of Dr. Phil and Debbie Higgins is not just about divorce. It is about youth, ambition, silence, and the long shadow of early choices. It is about how people tell their stories and which parts they choose to leave out. Whether Dr. Phil broke his silence depends on how one defines silence. He acknowledged the marriage. He admitted it failed. But he never stepped fully into the emotional details the way he asks others to do. And perhaps that contradiction is the most honest takeaway of all. Because no matter how much advice someone gives, no one escapes their past completely. It follows quietly, waiting to be remembered, reshaped, or questioned. And sometimes, the hardest truths are the ones we never fully say out loud. Dr. Phil's story did not begin with television lights, applause, or a studio audience. Long before he became a household name, he was simply Phil McGraw, a young man trying to figure out his future. Growing up, Phil had dreams like many others. He was focused on sports, education, and building a life that felt meaningful. During his teenage years, he met Debbie Higgins, his high school sweetheart. Their relationship felt natural and full of hope, the kind of love that seems strong enough to last forever when you are young. They married early, believing that commitment and ambition would be enough to carry them through adulthood. But life moved faster than they expected. As the years passed, it became clear that they were growing in different directions. The responsibilities of marriage, combined with personal uncertainty and changing goals, created distance between them. Eventually, they began living apart. There was no public drama, no headlines, and no public statements. The separation was quiet and handled privately. In 1973, only about 3 years after their wedding, their divorce was finalized. The marriage that began with teenage optimism ended without celebration or closure. For Phil, this was not just the end of a relationship. but the collapse of an early dream. At that point in his life, he had also lost his football aspirations and was questioning who he was meant to become. The divorce left emotional weight that he did not talk about publicly, but it clearly shaped him. Instead of dwelling on the pain, he turned inward and focused on education. He poured his energy into psychology, trying to understand people, behavior, and emotional struggle. It is possible that he was searching for answers to questions he could not solve in his own life. Debbie, on the other hand, chose a very different path. She stayed away from public attention and lived a private life. She later worked in film editing and production, choosing to stay behind the scenes rather than in front of the camera. While Phil's life would eventually unfold in front of millions, Debbie's life remained largely unknown to the public. She passed away in 2014 after a battle with cancer, having lived most of her life far removed from the fame that would later surround her former husband. At the time of their divorce, no one could have predicted what Phil's future would look like. There was no television show, no best-selling books, and no connection to Oprah Winfrey. He was simply a man starting over, carrying quiet heartbreak, and trying to build a new identity. This early chapter of his life faded into the background, but its emotional impact never truly disappeared. It laid the foundation for the driven, focused, and sometimes intense personality that viewers would later see on television. Years later, Dr. Phil would rise to a level of fame that few psychologists ever experience. His television career transformed him into a recognizable figure across America. His face appeared on billboards, his books topped bestseller lists, and his daytime talk show reached millions of viewers every afternoon. To the public, it looked like success came easily, but behind the scenes, the pressure was constant. Running a nationally syndicated television show was not just about sitting in a chair and asking questions. It required long hours, careful planning, and constant awareness of ratings and public opinion. Every season brought new challenges, including competition for other shows, changing audience expectations, and growing criticism from journalists and professionals. Dr. Phil was not only a host, he was involved in production decisions, guest selection, and maintaining the show's relevance in a fast-moving media world. At the same time, he had to protect his credibility as someone trained in psychology. This balance was difficult. His direct and firm style attracted loyal viewers who appreciated clear advice and tough love. However, it also attracted criticism. Some mental health professionals believed that serious psychological issues were being turned into entertainment. Others felt his approach was too harsh or oversimplified complex problems. As his popularity grew, so did the scrutiny. One of the biggest controversies involved his professional credentials. Dr. Phil earned a doctorate in clinical psychology, but in 2006, he stopped renewing his psychology license. This decision raised many questions. Viewers wondered whether it was appropriate for him to continue using the title doctor while giving advice on addiction, trauma, and relationships on national television. Critics argued that without an active license, his authority was weakened. Some accused him of hypocrisy, saying he was offering psychological guidance without practicing as a licensed clinician. Dr. Phil responded by explaining that his television role was not clinical therapy. He described himself as an educator and media personality, not a practicing psychologist. He emphasized that guests on his show were not his patients, and that the program followed entertainment standards, not medical ones. While this explanation satisfied some viewers, the criticism never fully went away. The questions about his role and responsibility followed him year after year. As the show continued, past episodes resurfaced, former guests spoke out, and journalists examined his methods more closely. The line between helping people and creating compelling television became a constant topic of debate. Through it all, Dr. Phil rarely addressed every accusation directly. Instead, he focused on continuing his work, Even as the pressure mounted from all sides, the success that once seemed so impressive now came with a heavy cost. Fame brought influence, but it also brought doubt, judgment, and an endless demand to prove himself.